There is a moment that lives outside of time, a moment so compressed, so absolute in its violence and its strange, brutal intimacy, that the men who survive it carry it for the rest of their lives like a second skeleton inside their own bodies. It does not announce itself. It does not warn. 1 second you are bleeding into the volcanic sand of a Pacific island most people cannot find on a map, and the next second a man is standing over you with a sword, and the two of you are looking at each other, and the entire war, all of its maps and strategies and grand speeches and distant politics, has collapsed into a single wordless question. Who will be alive in the next 10 seconds? This is the story of John L. Elab, a young man from a generation that did not flinch, who joined a war because the war was simply there, who crossed oceans and endured disease and walked into one of the most catastrophic beaches in Marine Corps history, and who survived because even lying wounded in the sand, even with shrapnel tearing through his leg, even with a Japanese officer raising a blade above him, something in John Elab refused to accept the ending that had been written for him. Remember his name, because what he did on that beach in November of 1943 was not the stuff of movies. It was messier than that. It was more human than that. And it was more terrifying than anything a screenwriter would dare put on paper. He was 19 years old when he enlisted in 1942. That fact alone deserves a moment of stillness, because 19 is so young that most of us at that age are still arguing with our parents about curfews, still confused about what we want to be, still soft in all the places that life has not yet hardened. But John Elab was 19 years old in 1942, and the world was on fire, and his explanation for why he joined was so simple it almost sounds like a joke. Hell, the war was on, he would later say, and everyone and his brother were joining it in one way or another. So he did. That is the entire reasoning. No grand declaration of patriotism, no elaborate ideology, just the plain, unvarnished logic of a young man who looked at the world around him and decided that if there was a thing to be done, then it was time to do it. There is something almost frightening in that simplicity. The ease with which an entire generation walked toward the grinding machinery of global warfare because the alternative was standing aside while history moved without them. He enlisted as a rifleman. There is a kind of poetry in that title too, though it is the roughest possible kind of poetry, the poetry of function, of purpose without ornamentation. A rifleman does not plan the battles. A rifleman does not sit in command tents moving markers across maps. A rifleman goes where he is told and does what must be done at the sharpest, most unforgiving edge of conflict, with nothing between himself and the enemy but training, instinct, and whatever stubborn will to survive he brought with him from home. After boot camp, Private Elab received his orders. He was going to Samoa, where he would link up with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division. At the time, those words, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, were already carrying the weight of hard history. These were men who had been in the Pacific long enough to understand what the Pacific was actually asking of them. They had learned what the jungle could do. They were learning what the ocean could hide. And they were about to learn, all of them, what a single invisible parasite could accomplish without firing a single shot. The journey from Samoa took the battalion to Guadalcanal, and it was there, as Elab would later write in a letter dated November 18, 2014, more than 7 decades after the fact, that he got malaria. Like all the rest, he noted. And that phrase is important because it captures something essential about the nature of disease in warfare. It is not selective. It does not spare the brave. It does not make accommodations for rank or skill or the particular urgency of a man's mission. It simply enters the blood, and then it does what it does. The numbers from the United States Army Office of Medical History tell a story that is almost impossible to absorb without stopping. Malaria was the single most serious health hazard to Allied troops in the South Pacific area during the entire war. Not enemy fire, not artillery, not the extraordinary ferocity of Japanese defensive positions. Malaria. It caused more than 5 times as many casualties as combat. 5 times. Which means that for every Marine or soldier cut down by bullets or grenades or bayonets, 5 others were taken out of the fight, some temporarily, some permanently, by a microscopic parasite carried by a mosquito in the heat and rot of a jungle that had never been meant for human habitation. Elab got malaria at Guadalcanal, the same as his brothers in arms, and the disease took enough of a toll on the men of the 2nd Marine Division that the decision was made to pull them out of the fight and send them somewhere they could recover, somewhere the air was cleaner and the nights were cooler, and the relentless attrition of tropical illness could be reversed, at least partially, before the next battle came. That somewhere was New Zealand. They spent 9 months there. 9 months of something that was not quite peace, because peace was a concept that had become theoretical, something that existed in memory and in the distant future but not in the present tense for men who had already seen Guadalcanal, but was at least recovery. Their bodies repaired themselves. Their strength returned. They trained. They prepared. And slowly, as those 9 months turned, and the Southern Hemisphere seasons shifted around them, word came down through the chain of command about where they were going next. The word was Tarawa. To understand what Tarawa meant, what it truly meant, not as a name on a map but as a physical and psychological reality, you have to understand what the island actually was. Tarawa is an atoll in the Gilbert Islands, a chain of coral and sand and reef stretched across the central Pacific like a necklace dropped carelessly into a vast blue nothing. The main island of Betio, which is where the Americans would land, was roughly the size of Central Park in New York City. 2 miles long, perhaps 800 yards across at its widest point, so small that you could walk its perimeter in an hour, so flat that you could see almost from one end to the other. A place with no hills to hide behind, no forests deep enough to offer concealment, no terrain whatsoever that would give an attacking force any natural advantage. And it was fortified to an almost incomprehensible degree. The Japanese commander responsible for Tarawa's defenses, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had reportedly boasted that the island could not be taken by 1,000,000 men in 100 years. That is the kind of statement that sounds like empty arrogance until you see what he had actually built. The island was covered in concrete bunkers with walls 4 feet thick. It bristled with artillery positions, anti-aircraft guns, machine gun nests, anti-tank ditches, and defensive barriers constructed from coconut logs. The beaches were strung with barbed wire. The approaches were mined. Every inch of potential landing ground had been pre-registered by Japanese gunners who had spent months calculating exactly where an attacking force would have to come ashore, and exactly what it would take to stop them there. There was also the reef. The reef around Betio was perhaps the most treacherous element of all, the one that no amount of planning could entirely account for, and the one that would turn the first hours of the battle into something that defied the imagination of even hardened combat veterans. Under normal tidal conditions, the reef would have had enough water over it for Higgins boats, the flat-bottomed landing craft that carried Marines to the shore, to pass without grounding. But on November 20, 1943, the tides did not cooperate. The water over the reef was inches deep instead of feet, and the Higgins boats ran aground 500 yards from shore. 500 yards in the open. Exposed to every weapon, the Japanese could bring to bear. The Marines had two choices. They could wait in the landing craft, sitting targets in the surf, hoping for conditions that might not come, or they could go over the sides and wade in. 500 yards through waist-deep and sometimes chest-deep water under fire, with weapons and equipment dragging them down, while the men in the bunkers on the beach did what men in fortified bunkers do to exposed infantry wading toward them across open water. They went in. And what followed on the beaches of Betio in those first terrible hours was among the worst carnage that American forces would experience in the entire Pacific War. Men died before they reached the water. Men died in the water. Men died trying to drag themselves up the beach. The sand turned red. The surf turned red. The Marine Corps, which had never in its history walked away from a fight it was ordered to take, paid the most savage possible price for the decision to attack Tarawa, and kept attacking anyway, because that was what the mission required, and because the alternative was to let those men die for nothing, and no Marine on that beach was willing to accept that. Nearly 6,400 Japanese soldiers, Korean laborers, and American service members would die in the 3 days the battle lasted, November 20 through November 23, 1943. 3 days on an island smaller than a city park. The mathematics of that slaughter are almost too stark to process. In roughly 72 hours, on a strip of coral and sand barely 2 miles long, more than 6,000 human beings lost their lives. The dead outnumbered the living inhabitants of many small American towns. The blood that soaked into that volcanic sand would not wash out for years. John Elab was in the middle of it. He was a private. He was 20 years old. He had survived malaria and 9 months of recovery, and the long ocean crossing and the terrifying approach through the surf. And now he was on the beach at Betio with his rifle and his training, and whatever private reserve of courage he had carried across the Pacific from the life he had left behind, and the battle was happening all around him. The details of exactly what transpired before the grenade are not recorded in the sources that survive. We do not know how long he had been ashore. We do not know what he had already seen or done by that point. We do not know whether he had fired his weapon, whether he had seen his fellow Marines fall around him, whether he had already done the things that combat requires of a rifleman in the middle of an active engagement. Those hours exist in the fog that descends over every battle, the fog that swallows specificity and leaves only fragments behind. What we know is what he himself described, decades later, with the spare economy of a man who has lived long enough with a memory that he no longer needs many words to summon it. He was hit with a grenade in the leg. Consider for a moment what that means in physical terms. A grenade in close proximity does not merely wound. It is an explosion, a pressure wave, a spray of metal fragments moving at velocities that the human body was never designed to withstand. The damage to soft tissue, to muscle and bone and nerve, is catastrophic even in cases where the victim survives. The pain is instant and total. And then, in the aftermath of that detonation, comes the secondary reality, the shock, the disorientation, the sudden awareness that the body has been fundamentally altered by a force it did not choose and cannot reverse. He went down. He was lying on the beach. Around him, the battle continued, the fire, the smoke, the sounds that no one who has heard them ever loses. And then, in the way that the worst moments of combat often arrive, not heralded by trumpets but simply present, a man appeared. A Japanese officer. Elab would later reflect that he thought the man was a warrant officer, a mid-grade officer experienced enough to still be standing and moving on a beach that had been consuming men of all ranks for hours. The officer came toward him, and then the two men looked at each other. That moment, that single, suspended moment of mutual recognition between two human beings on opposite sides of a war, deserves more space than history has given it. Because before anything else happened, before the sword came into view, before the terrible arithmetic of survival asserted itself, there was just that. Two men looking at each other, one standing, one on the ground. Both knowing, in that absolute and unambiguous way that only combat can produce, that what came next would determine which of them continued to exist in the world. Elab saw the sword. The sword was not metaphorical. Japanese officers of that era carried swords, the gunto, a military blade adapted from the traditional katana, as both functional weapons and symbols of their rank and the martial tradition they represented. In the chaos of close combat, on a beach where firearms might be empty or fouled with sand and salt water, a sword was not an anachronism. It was a weapon. It was real. And it was being raised by a man who had every intention of using it. Elab put his arm over his head and rolled. That is the description he gave. 4 words that contain an entire universe of instinct and will. He was wounded. He was in shock. He was on the ground. And instead of being paralyzed by the wound or the pain or the certainty of what was happening above him, something in his body, or perhaps something beneath the body, in whatever it is that drives a living creature to persist, made a decision. He moved. He deflected. He did what the body does when it refuses to be finished. The officer's sword came down and caught his arm. And then John Elab, lying wounded on the beach at Tarawa, did something that even now, nearly 8 decades later, seems to exist at the very edge of what is humanly possible. He grabbed the sword. He grabbed it. He took hold of the blade of a weapon that had just cut his arm, while he was lying in the sand with shrapnel in his leg, and he took it from the officer's hands. And then he used it. The officer died, and John Elab was alive. The aftermath of a moment like that is not what the movies suggest. There is no triumphant music. There is no pause for the gravity of what has just occurred. There is only the battle which continues, and the body which is failing, and the beach, which is still the beach at Betio, still one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The grenade wound was serious. More serious, the sources note, than what might have been expected from a man who had just physically overpowered an armed officer with his bare hands. The human capacity for violence in extremis is a remarkable thing, adrenaline performing biochemical miracles that the rational mind would declare impossible. But the wound was real, and it was significant, and it would require real medical attention. Elab was evacuated. The Battle of Tarawa ended on November 23, 1943, with an American victory purchased at a cost that shocked the nation when the casualty figures were released. The public, which had been accustomed to the careful, controlled management of wartime information, was confronted suddenly with photographs and numbers that could not be softened. Congress held hearings. The Navy and Marine Corps undertook reviews of their assault doctrine. Tarawa changed the way America fought amphibious battles, because Tarawa demonstrated, in the most brutal terms imaginable, what it cost to get it wrong. Elab did not witness those institutional consequences from the inside. He was on his way to Naval Hospital San Diego, where the doctors and nurses would do what they could for his leg and his arm, and the damage that 72 hours on the most contested beach in the Central Pacific had done to his body. He would receive the kind of care that a nation owes its wounded, and when the care was complete, or as complete as it could be, given the nature of what he had survived, he would be released with a 50% disability rating. 50%. That number represents, in the cold administrative language of the military medical system, the permanent cost of what Tarawa had taken from him. Not everything, but half of something. A balance shifted that could not be shifted back. The grenade had done what grenades do, and no amount of surgery or physical therapy or the passage of time could entirely undo it. Private First Class Elab, he had been promoted, a recognition of his service that the record preserves even if the specific circumstances of the promotion are not detailed in the surviving sources, finished out his service at a military base in Rhode Island, far from the Pacific, far from the beaches, doing whatever the Corps needed him to do with what he had left, until 1945, when the war finally ended, and the long, strange work of returning to ordinary life could begin. What that return looked like, how a man reconstructs the architecture of a normal existence after what Elab had experienced, is not something the historical record captures with any specificity. That is perhaps the greatest invisible cost of war, not the wounds that can be measured and rated at 50%, but the interior reconstruction that has to happen afterward, the quiet daily labor of learning to live inside a peace that the body still does not entirely believe in, the dreams and the memories and the particular way that certain sounds or smells can collapse time and put you back on that beach in an instant, lying in the sand, looking up at a sword. Elab went on. He recovered as much as recovery was possible. He built a life. He aged. He watched the world change around him in ways that would have been unimaginable to the 19-year-old who had enlisted in 1942 because the war was on and everyone was joining. By the time the world caught up with him again, by the time people started asking him about what he had done and what it had meant, John Elab was 93 years old and living in Boise, Idaho. 93. Think about that number and think about what it contains. The young men he trained with, the men he served alongside on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, the officer on the beach whose sword he took, the thousands who died in those 3 days on an island the size of a city park. He had outlived all of it. He had carried all of it. And here he was, 93 years old, still standing or nearly standing, because he himself acknowledged that his balance was a little off. A little off. A man who had been hit by a grenade, who had been cut by a sword, who had spent his 20s fighting the Japanese in the South Pacific and his middle years living with the physical consequences of that fighting, and his assessment of his current condition at 93 was that his balance was a little off, but otherwise he felt okay in every way he could now. That is the voice of his generation. That is the precise register of men who did extraordinary things and came home and refused to be defined by them, refused to make the suffering louder than necessary, refused to claim more than they had earned or complain more than the situation truly warranted. A little off balance, feeling okay. This from a man who had done things on a beach in the Pacific that most human beings, presented with the same circumstances, would not have survived. And what did he want to say, after all of it, to the young men and women currently serving in the armed forces of the United States? Not a lecture about duty, not a speech about sacrifice, not a complex moral accounting of everything that had been given and taken and lost. Just this: thank you for your service. It is a phrase that has become, in more recent times, so common that it has lost some of its weight, a social formula, a polite acknowledgement offered at airports and sporting events with varying degrees of genuine feeling. But coming from John Elab at 93, having done what he had done on the beaches of Tarawa, the phrase carries a different gravity. He knew what service cost. He had paid in blood and bone and 50% disability, and all the invisible things that percentage cannot measure. And still, his instinct was not to demand recognition for himself, but to extend it outward, to the ones who were still doing the work he had done, on beaches and in deserts, and in cities he might not have been able to find on a map. That instinct, that reflexive generosity toward those still in the fight, is perhaps the most revealing thing about him. More than the moment with the sword, more than the documented heroism on the beach at Betio, the simple human impulse to say thank you tells us something essential about who John Elab was. The sword told us he could survive. The thank you told us how. The Battle of Tarawa receded into history the way all battles eventually do, studied, analyzed, commemorated, and gradually eclipsed by the events that followed it. The island itself, so strategically vital in November of 1943, became a stepping stone in a campaign that swept across the Central Pacific toward the Philippines, and ultimately toward the Japanese home islands. The men who died there were eventually recovered, some of them, from the sand and the coral and the water where they had fallen. Though many were not found for decades, their remains scattered by time and tide, and the indifferent persistence of the sea. What Tarawa taught the military was tactical, the importance of better pre-assault bombardment, of specialized landing craft that could clear reefs, of more accurate hydrographic intelligence, of lessons written in the blood of the men who went in without those advantages. Future operations, Kwajalein, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, were planned with Tarawa's lessons factored into every calculation. But what Tarawa taught the rest of us is something different and harder to quantify. It taught us what a 20-year-old rifleman is capable of when the situation strips away everything except the most fundamental human question: do you want to keep living? And the answer in the case of John Elab was not dramatic or articulate. It was physical. It was immediate. It was a hand reaching out in the sand to grab the thing that was being used to end him. He grabbed the sword. He is not famous for it. His name does not appear in the official histories of Tarawa, alongside the names of medal recipients and commanding officers. He is a private first class with a 50% disability rating who lived to be 93 and moved to Boise, Idaho, and who once, in a letter to his old battalion written more than 70 years after the fact, recounted the moment with the kind of calm matter-of-factness that makes it simultaneously more and less believable. More because the simplicity of his account has the specific texture of truth. The way he notes that he thought the officer was a warrant officer, not certain but probably, the kind of detail that a person inventing a heroic story would not bother to hedge. Less, because the human mind resists, on some level, the full reality of what it means to take a sword from a man who has just cut your arm while you are lying wounded on a beach. But it happened. The historical record is clear. The letter exists. The disability rating exists. The man existed, and as of the writing of his account, he was still existing, balance a little off, feeling okay, living in Idaho with the weight of everything he had carried from November 1943 to wherever the calendar had brought him. There is a version of this story that ends with grand statements about heroism and sacrifice and the debt that nations owe their defenders. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, because what Elab's story actually demonstrates is something quieter and more permanent than heroism, which is a word we use for individual acts. What it demonstrates is endurance, the particular human capacity to survive not just the moment of crisis, but everything that comes after it. The disease and the recovery and the wound and the disability and the decades and the slow erosion of the body and the way that time takes everything eventually, including the sharpness of the worst memories, and leaves you sitting somewhere quiet, balance a little off, feeling okay. That is what it looks like to have been on the beach at Tarawa and to have come home. That is what it looks like to have grabbed the sword. John L. Elab enlisted at 19. He fought on Guadalcanal and survived malaria. He landed on the beach at Betio on November 20, 1943, and survived the most concentrated fire the Japanese could bring to bear. He was hit by a grenade. He was cut by a sword. He took the sword. He survived. He went to Naval Hospital San Diego. He finished his service in Rhode Island. He was released with 50% disability. He lived his life. He turned 93. He said thank you. The beach at Betio is quiet now. The concrete bunkers have crumbled but not entirely disappeared. The tropical sun and decades of salt air have done their work. But the walls that were built to withstand 1 million men in 100 years are stubborn, and pieces of them remain, half buried in sand that is red no longer. The reef is still there. The tides still do what they do, indifferent to the history of a single morning in November 1943, when they were lower than expected and thousands of Marines were left exposed in open water. Nothing marks the exact spot where a 20-year-old rifleman lay wounded in that sand and refused to die. But he knows where it was. And now so do you. If this story stayed with you, if the image of a wounded young man reaching for a sword in the sand of Betio is something you will carry into your week, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Each story we tell is a story that deserves to be remembered, and your subscription is what makes that possible. If you found value here, a like takes 2 seconds, and it helps more people find these histories before they disappear entirely. And we want to hear from you. When you imagine yourself in Elab's position lying on that beach, wounded with an armed officer standing over you, what do you think you would have done? Is survival in that moment a matter of training, of instinct, or of something else entirely? Something harder to name? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every one.